that. And that. Are we okay here? Yeah. Very good. Yes, so I will talk about knowledge resistance and rationality in the context of this issue about trust in experts and the role of experts in a democracy. There's currently, over the last few years, since I wrote it really started around 2016 for obvious reasons because of the political events then, but we started getting a lot of talk about this notion of fact resistance, knowledge resistance, both in public life, but also, of course, increasingly so in research. Although the topic of knowledge resistance had actually existed for a while in certain pockets of research spread out here and there. The thing about knowledge resistance, and this is why one has to approach it in an interdisciplinary way, is that it involves this very complex interaction between internal mechanisms, psychological mechanisms, and the external environment, the informational and political external environment. And a central source of knowledge resistance concerns precisely trust, because it involves irrational distrust in reliable sources, as well as, of course, irrational trust in unreliable sources. So this has been one of those things we've been looking into from various directions. But recently, and it's been clear from the start, and that was also part of our hypothesis in our application to this program, that it may not be the case that everything that looks irrational actually is irrational, because there could be alternative explanations for why a subject rejects evidence. And I will talk a little bit about this. But recently in philosophy, this has become a very big trend. There's been several people saying, hey, wait a minute, a lot of these data, we get experimental data, but other polls and similar things, there are alternative explanations of why people seemingly reject evidence. And in fact, a lot more of what's going on is perfectly rational. And that is an interesting claim, we think, and an important one to investigate, both philosophically and empirically, because of course, if the assumption is that people are just irrational and resisting things in irrational ways, then there's one response I want to take to this. There should be a lot of focus on individual cognition, critical thinking, and so on. But if the hypothesis instead is that, now I have a weird sound, I don't know if that's true for everybody else. You also got the disturbances. Let me hold off for a second because it's hard. Yeah, that's much better. No, it's not. Let's see. Okay, I'll try to go on. If instead the alternative hypothesis is that actually people are being very rational, it's their environment that's being dysfunctional, that requires a different kind of remedy. I think the sound is very bad now for the people online. Is that true? Is it just me? No, it is true. So there is some kind of disturbing noise. Okay, how about that? No, I'm sorry. Let's see what we can do.
We're hearing well here. I don't know what's going on over there.
Well, online, I think it's not just me. There is a very, very disturbing sound, like it's going, this kind of going around a bit. It's correct, right? It's not just me. Someone was nodding here. Yeah.
If everyone can mute their speakers and microphones other than the speaker.
Yeah, that might be a good idea. Okay. No. Let's see. No. Okay, let's see how it goes. Maybe now. Yes? Okay, let's hope for this. So it's important if you think about, our program is called Knowledge Resistance, Causes, Consequences, and Cure, because of course we want to remedy what's going on when people reject available evidence. So then it's important to understand how much of this is deriving from individual irrationality and how much from other sources. It's still a problem, I'm afraid. I don't know if we need to restart this or something. Let's see. Well, while we wait for this to be fixed, hopefully I will give you, this is my plan. This is what I'm going to be doing today. Let's see now. And now it sounds a little better, I think. Yeah? Oh, promising. Okay, very good. Thank you. I see someone else nodding again. It's good to see that. All righty. So here we go. So I'm going to do three things here. I'm going to first talk a little bit about this concept of knowledge resistance, which is not completely clear what it involves, of course. I will talk about these alternative explanations according to which the rejection is perfectly rational. And then I will connect that with this question of distrust in experts. And so let me start talking about knowledge resistance. And it was mentioned in this program, and we have about 30 plus researchers from across Europe and the US involved, but here are the 4 PIs from philosophy, political science, psychology, and media and communication research. And I should say that the work I do on the nature of knowledge resistance and rationality, I do in collaboration with Katrin Gluer, who you see there, who is my colleague, philosophy. Alrighty, so in our program, we decided early on that we wanted to focus on some topics. So it would be, we would have a clear focus on those topics that we picked were climate change, immigration, vaccines, and GMOs, factual claims relating to these areas. Of course, we started out in 2019. Little do we know there was going to be a pandemic, and the vaccine issue would become even much bigger, more complicated than we had anticipated. We chose these topics because, first of all, they're policy relevant. There's this interesting connection with policy. This is why we care about knowledge resistance ultimately. They're polarized, politically polarized. And they concern facts that admit of scientific evidence, and that's important. Some of the knowledge resistant work earlier, or so-called knowledge resistant work earlier in psychology especially, has been on issues like, you know, what people's attitudes towards a death penalty is a famous study. The problem with those cases is that they involve not just factual claims, but value claims too. So we're trying to stay away from those and just look at issues involving where there can be knowledge in an uncontroversial way and ways of finding out how things are. So knowledge resistance then involves a kind of ignorance, but it is an ignorance that can't be fixed by supplying information precisely because the information is resisted, and this is a challenge. Now, for someone to be knowledge resistant, of course, the information has to be available to the person, and there's a lot of unpacking to do when you talk about availability. The strongest notion of availability, of course, is that you have the evidence. You read what the latest climate panel says, for example, or you read what the New York Times says about climate change, let's say. And the subject needs to have, and it's empirical evidence we're talking about again, and the subject needs to have a tendency to resist that kind of information. So first sort of try at giving some kind of definition that you can work with is that knowledge resistance involves a tendency to resist available empirical evidence. And there's lots to be said about that. I will say a couple of things here, but Katrin and I have a recent paper where we try to unpack this more. Now, most people who talk about knowledge resistance, including us, take it that knowledge resistance involves irrationality of some sort. but it's not completely clear what people mean when they talk about irrational here, or rationality. So it's important to say a couple of words about that. First, there is the distinction between epistemic and practical rationality, where epistemic rationality concerns the rationality of belief, which is a function of evidence, further beliefs the subject has. And then there is practical rationality, which concerns the rationality of action, which is a function of belief and desire. And I will get back to this issue briefly soon. Then there's a distinction between what you might call subjective and objective rationality. This can mean many different things. But in this context, because we're interested in explanations, we're interested in explaining why people reject evidence. What we are interested in is subjective rationality, in the sense that what is rational for this person, given what this person believes already. And this causes all sorts of issues, actually, when you look at the paradigm experimental designs for knowledge resistance, because they have trouble distinguishing cases where someone rejects evidence because of being knowledge resistant, and when they reject it because of their prior beliefs. And it's actually hard to design experiments, and we are just busily doing that with the psychologists now, but that can sort that confound out. But of course, even if someone rejects evidence because of prior beliefs, so say, for example, commonly know enough that someone rejects the claim that vaccines are safe because they have a conspiracy theory about, you know, the pharmaceutical companies or something like that. Now, then it is rational to believe that vaccines are not safe. But of course, the question is, how rational is that conspiracy theory belief? And then you have to go way back in the subject's information history and see if there is upstream irrationality at some point. If there isn't, then it's not a case of knowledge resistance as we define it. So I'll talk more about this. And then the third thing, maybe worth mentioning, because there's a lot of talk about this idea of ecological rationality, which is the idea that there are these heuristics, shortcuts, cognitive shortcuts that we do, which allow us to sort of function pretty well, but in a particular case may lead us wrong and may lead us to irrational belief formation. And there's direct rationality, where you're talking directly about whether this particular belief is rational, and we are interested in direct rationality. So we're interested in epistemic, subjective, direct rationality. 2 words about the evidence too. The relevant evidence is almost exclusively testimonial. It concerns a source that says that P. This is in the nature of things, as it were. There's some cases in the literature where you could say knowledge resistance involves experiential evidence, resisting the evidence from what your eyes or what you hear. But it's much more rare. And it also is, of course, related to the fact that the types of issues where knowledge resistance tends to kick in are these policy relevant facts where politics enter. And those kinds of facts about the climate or immigration or vaccines are facts that we get through testimony typically, or is knowledge that we get through testimony. So if you want to be careful here and spell out the content of the relevant evidence, and you think of evidence in terms of probabilification, which many people do, we suggest that the relevant information has this form S says that P. So when a climate scientist goes out and says that carbon dioxide emissions cause global warming, the evidence is NN says that carbon dioxide causes global warming. And that's evidence for P that carbon dioxide cause global warming. If S is reliable, and this, of course, is a very big part of it. Now, the other thing about knowledge resistance, of course, is that it's not just random irrationality. The standard assumption is that there is the patterns in this phenomena that explain that are explained by underlying psychological mechanisms. And there's a bunch of those to be found in the psychological literature, include things like confirmation bias, bias assimilation, biased memory retrieval, truth bias, etc. But the most important mechanism that people have talked about most is this notion of motivated reasoning. And that's been studied by psychologists for decades. It is the idea that we desire to hold on to certain beliefs. Sometimes belief formation is driven by desire, by directional goals, as it is said. And then we employ our reasoning capacities to defend these beliefs, the cherished beliefs. More recently, this has been studied by any number of people the last decade, but famously Dan Kahan has carried out a bunch of experiments on what he calls politically motivated reasoning. And here is how he defines motivated reasoning. It's the tendency of individuals to unconsciously conform assessment of factual information to some goal collateral to assessing its truth. These are the directional goals that psychologists talk about. And these goals can be any number of goals. I mean, it can be a goal of, maybe very vain, so you want to protect the belief that you have the biggest audience ever, or maybe you are, you're very concerned about your children, so you protect certain beliefs about them being terrific in every possible way when that's not true. But the kind of motivated reasoning, the kind of goal that Dan Kahan has been looking at a lot, and that's why this is very interesting from the point of view of policy, is identity protection. And he calls this politically motivated reasoning because it is the idea that when people belong to certain, we all have a tendency to try to protect beliefs that become a mark of identity of our particular group, a political, cultural, ideological group. So if my group has a certain view on immigration, vaccines, climate change, so on, and the evidence comes out from research that this view is false, there will be a tendency to reject the evidence, to hold on to the belief because it has become a mark of identity. So this then involves this kind of skewed cognitive processing where goal incongruent information is selectively processed as if it had lower evidential value than it actually has. And this kind of skewed processing is typical of motivated reasoning in general. And here the skewedness derives from the desire to protect a belief that has become a mark of identity of the group. And this I might as well say this is right away, that this is when a belief becomes a mark of identity of a group depends very much on what, and this is something the political science talk about a lot, what they call the political elite actors, that is to say politicians and opinion leaders. So it matters a lot what goes on in the political environment. For example, it's interesting about the climate issue. I think when I lived in the US in the 90s, it was not so clearly marked that it was something that Republicans were questioning. They had different views on policy than the Democrats, but they accepted the science. And now that's changed because it's become this very big political mark on these factual issues. I will come back to this. So now I want to talk a little bit about this alternative explanation, the suggestion that all of this is perfectly rational when people reject evidence. First of all, Kahan himself has spoken about something he calls tragic rationality. He says that really the problem is not that people are not rational enough, but that they're too rational. This politically motivated reasoning reflects too much rationality, he says. Because our standing with others is so incredibly essential to our well-being. So for this reason, it's perfectly rational to hold on to beliefs that have become identity defining. By contrast, it says, an ordinary citizen pays no price for forming a perception of facts that is contrary to the best available empirical evidence. No price for rejecting the facts, but a high price for not sticking with the group. Now, that may be, but of course, again, just to get back to where I started, this is a practical rationality he's talking about. It may be that it's practically rational to avoid evidence or assess it incorrectly because one desires to stick with the group. But it isn't epistemically rational. And Kahan is not really saying that either, but he tends to be not very clear on the distinction between practical and epistemic rationality here. I know that there are discussions in philosophy about whether there can be practical reasons for belief, but it doesn't really matter, because even if there can, it's not going to be epistemically rational when you do this kind of thing. And an interesting question, of course, is whether it really is practically rational to do this kind of thing. I mean, if you think it maybe climate change, you know, you're not going to live that long, you don't worry about what's going to happen to future generations or people in different countries. But with the vaccine case, of course, with COVID, it is an interesting question whether it really was practically rational for these large groups of people to reject the evidence that vaccines were safe when it led to illness and death in their own case. Assuming people want to live, it seems practically irrational. So that's Kant's take on the idea that this is that there is a lot of rationality, too much rationality involved here. But again, it is not the epistemic rationality that we are interested with. So I'm going to set that aside and look in some more detail at Neil Levy's recent work on this stuff, because I think that's quite interesting. He makes the case that what he calls bad beliefs are largely, overwhelmingly, mostly rational, even if they don't appear to be that. The bad beliefs, he has a recent book on that, but a series of papers too, are beliefs that are controversial but shouldn't be given the scientific consensus. They're bad because there is this easily available expert consensus, available evidence that they're false, they're not well grounded. But Levy's hypothesis is that the central cases of bad belief, climate change, again, these sort of cases that we're discussing, are produced by a genuinely wholly rational process where the subject responds appropriately to the evidence. And this is part of his reasoning here, is he brings in this social dimension of human knowledge, the central role of trust. And in particular, he talks a lot about echo chambers. Now, echo chambers are networks characterized by relations of trust and distrust. They may include diverse voices, and in that sense, they differ from what has come to be called epistemic bubbles or filter bubbles, where there is no diversity of the voices. An echo chamber, there may be diversity of voices, but the subject weighs these voices very differently, discounting views that come from outgroup members. And Levy's central claim is that we all belong to echo chambers, and within these chambers, things are going well when it comes to rationality, even if we end up having bad beliefs. Now, the idea, of course, is not that biased reasoning is a genuinely rational process, but rather that what looks like biased reasoning, when you only consider ordinary first-order evidence, actually, in fact, turns out to be perfectly rational when you take in the social nature of testimonial knowledge production, and which is to say, when you take in what he calls second-order evidence, social cues about what's reliable. And the cues that he talks a lot about are these two cues of competence and benevolence. Competence obviously indicates that people are reliable in the sense of producing, giving knowledge, communicating knowledge, and benevolence has to do with trustworthiness. So they won't lie to you. And these cues of competence and benevolence make us trust the people in our echo chamber, certain people that belong to our group. And here's a typical quote: "In trusting my fellow partisans, I trust those who tend to get the factual right in the factual and normative domains. Conversing, distrusting outgroup testimony, I discard the testimony of those who are less likely to be competent and more likely to be deceptive. None of this is epistemically objectionable." So within these echo chambers, we are all perfectly rational. Things go wrong, not because there's something wrong with our cognitive, individual cognition, but because the epistemic environment is polluted. And I'm going to get back to what pollution means precisely here. Now, I think this in-group, out-group point there's something to it, definitely, and it's connected with prior beliefs, the way I was talking about before. But I think I'm just going to give you a brief take on what the view Katrina and I take on this, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about Levy's specific views about experts. The question is, of course, whether it really is rational to accept testimony from the in-group simply because it comes from the in-group, from people that have provided these cues to me. And if you look at a lot of the research around this, for example, of people who say that they have approve of Trump, they have high trust in Trump, but they also know that he lies a lot. That is many polls have been showing this. And the question then, okay, they find him benevolent in the sense that he shares their values, I guess. But is it really epistemically rational to accept what he says as true when you also know, or you also believe, that he's very unreliable and lies a lot? Similar questions arise when it comes to trusting media that you know is highly partisan. Is it really rational to trust media that you do know is has a function of communicating partisan information? And here there's some interesting, and this goes for the left too, I should say, but here there's some interesting data on, you know, what sources are the most trusted by different groups. So for example, 4 of the US news sources and opinion sources that contain the highest proportion of false statements were highly trusted by a strong majority of conservatives, 51 to 88%. And these include things like Tucker Carlson and things like that too. Now, that of course, one would have to look in detail there at whether people know that these sources are unreliable, but there's a lot of evidence that they do. And then the question is whether it really is epistemically rational to trust them. Conversely, is it really rational to reject testimony from the outgroup simply because it comes from the outgroup? And Levy actually says no, but he says it's actually very rare that we give no weight at all to dissenting testimony, that we completely just dismiss testimony from the outgroup. We give it some weight, and we only really dismiss it completely when we're extremely confident that P is true. And then it's also, Levy says, rational to reject the testimony. And of course, that is true, but here we have an empirical question, right? Is it the case that people only reject the outgroup testimony when they are extremely confident about P, about a statement by global warming or vaccines, for example? And the other, so that's an empirical question that Levy doesn't provide evidence for. One would have to look at that. But of course, one would also need to know that the extreme confidence is justified. Otherwise, we have a very bad case of problematic bootstrapping here. So a subject who says, a subject who dismisses what the CDC says about vaccines, or what the FISA says about the election being not rigged. Does she really have reasons with these particular claims to be extremely confident that she can reject the dissenting testimony? So I think it's going to be really hard to make this case that these things are perfectly rational. Even though the program hypothesis from the start was that there is a lot more rationality going on in these cases than what we think. I think Levy goes too far in this case. And now I'm going to talk about that in the context of, here is just this idea that he goes too far. The objection is not that we can't imagine conditions under which it is perfectly rational to believe what seems to be very crazy things. I think we can imagine such conditions, sect-like fundamentalist conditions. And there's a nice paper by Baumann from 2007 where he talks about rational fundamentalism, he spells out the conditions under which it can be perfectly irrational to believe the craziest things. But the kind of isolation, the kind of context you need for that to make sense is not the sort of conditions that we know people who live in society are. And therefore, our hypothesis is that there is a fair bit of irrationality going on here. So let me go over to the case of distrusting the experts and apply some of Levy's ideas in this case, in this particular case. So we know, of course, when we look across Europe, but also in the US, we have a lot of data on trust. And we know that there are large groups where trust in science, in experts, is very low. In Sweden and several other European countries, you have this interesting situation where the total level of trust is fairly, trust in science, but also trust in other democratic institutions, media, is fairly constant over time. But once you look under the surface, as it were, you can see there's a very clear political polarization in trust, so that people who vote, we have now a large right-wing populist party. People on that side of the political spectrum have very low trust in science, in experts and media, whereas people who vote social democrats on the left have high trust. So we've had this political polarization of trust. So the question is, what explains this sort of patterns of low trust? And Levy's central claim is that it is what he calls epistemic pollution. And I will explain in a minute what that is. And there are many explanations here, of course, but I'm going to just mention these three here. Another one has to do with the politicization of factual claims, where there is a blurring of facts and values. And I will say a few words about that. And the third one, of course, is just deliberate efforts to sow doubt on experts. They talk about fake media being the most famous case, but of course there is a lot of deliberate disinformation being sent out, undermining people's trust in science. And I think this is something that Levy does not take into account sufficiently. What he talks about is again these cues of competence and benevolence relating to experts. And the competence cues that he discusses are the sort of familiar ones: credentials, track record, argumentative capacity, intellectual honesty. You stick with the sort of scientific methodology, expert consensus, things like that. But what he says about this is that these competence cues don't work in the current epistemic landscape, because he says our epistemic landscape is polluted because the cues for expertise and expertise don't correlate well with actual possession. This fact greatly reduces people's capacity to distinguish reliable from unreliable sources. At the same time, the fact that such deception is widely known to occur reduces trust in legitimate sources. What does he talk about then when he says that the cues for expertise don't correlate well with its actual possession? Well, he discusses these sort of well-known cases, merchants of doubt, of course, where scientists enlist, they're bought by big companies to produce poor science in support of denialism, science denialism. There's the new phenomenon of fake and predatory journals. There's the replication crisis. So according to Levy, these sort of faults or flaws in scientific practice recent years have the consequence that these cues for expertise don't correlate well with its actual possession, and therefore it is perfectly rational to not trust in experts. And I think, I mean, there are certainly problems here, and there are problems that we need to talk about, and it's also talked about a lot. I mean, take the replication crisis. I mean, everybody immediately stepped up to the plate trying to find ways of dealing with that. The journals changed their practices and so on. So of course there are these problems, but I think the claim that because there are these dysfunctional cases in science, we can infer that the cues for expertise don't correlate well with its actual possession, I think is just false. Credentials, track record, argumentative capacity, intellectual honesty, and consensus do correlate well with possession of expertise, even if there are cases where it fails. So I think here very much, I think there have been propaganda actors have been using these sort of problems within science to promote the idea that science is totally unreliable. But I think it's way too strong to say that these cues don't actually correlate with actual possession of expertise. So that's the competence cue that he thinks is polluted, and I question that. Then there's the question about benevolence cues, and benevolence has to do with sharing of values for Levy. So Levy says that the reason conservatives reject science more than liberals is just that they're just unlucky in their echo chamber. It's rational to do so. They don't defer to scientists, the conservatives, because they fail to pass a test for benevolence, even if experts exhibit cues for competence, which Levy also questions. Liberals are just epistemically luckier. They defer to groups of expert deliberators, but that's just luck, because it so happens that the experts share the values of the liberals more. Again, Levy makes the case that this is rational, to give more weight to testimony of people we see as benevolent towards us. This is a kind of bias, but it is a rational one, because those who don't share my values may seek to exploit me. That's the idea. But again, I question this. I mean, I wonder why scientists fail to pass a test for benevolence. Is it just because their scientific findings don't support the preferred policy proposals? That then would not be a rational reaction. If one rejects the science about climate change, for example, because one doesn't want to do the kinds of things that politicians think we should do to counteract climate change, that can't be explained as rational, because by appealing to the idea that these experts are not benevolent because they're not producing the science that's needed for the policy proposals I prefer. And if you look, I mean, I think here there's lots of interesting data now, of course, on trust. And here that just came out from Pew on Republicans' trust in medical scientists, and that it's down sharply since the coronavirus outbreak. Why would that be? Not because medical scientists have been incompetent. There's certainly been a lot of competence around that. But it's very likely here that's what's going on is, of course, that the science produced by medical scientists doesn't fit well with the kind of policy proposals that conservatives prefer. Well, mostly then the lack of policy proposals, that is that there shouldn't be no mask mandates and things like that. So here you see this kind of blurring between the factual grounds for policy decisions and the values, what the goals are when making policy. And this is, I'm going to end by saying a couple of words about that and the role of experts in this. Because I do think, I think there are deliberate efforts to blurring the line between facts and values when it comes to policy questions by politicians like Trump and others who want to sow doubt about the science because it doesn't fit the policy they prefer, and therefore they make it unclear the distinction between the scientific basis for a policy decision and the values that drive the decision. So we should therefore not go for that. We should be very clear here that, of course, science provides the basis for policy decisions, but it doesn't dictate policy, precisely because you need values as well. One thing that was very interesting about, I'm sure in every country across the world, there were intense debates about the role of what policies we should have and so on. But one thing that was interesting there was how clear it became that a lot of these debates concern value conflicts. Is it more valuable to keep the kids in school or to minimize the spread? So these are value conflicts. And these are not things that scientists should pronounce on, I think. And I think, therefore, as experts in the public debate, we need to be very clear that on this difference between the scientific basis for a decision and the values. We need to make sure that we don't contribute to the blurring of the difference between facts and values. Also, as experts in, climate science or whatever, our expertise doesn't extend to values. And this, I think, is not sufficiently made clear by a lot of people. There are lots of experts who want to participate in the public debate. Of course, that they can do, and I do it myself, but then I have to be very clear on how far my expertise extends. Here is a statement from the American Meteorological Society. I just thought it was interesting. You can see lots of this online. What is the role of science in policy? Well, they say scientists attempt to achieve their goals by providing information, fine, educating policymakers, or by championing particular policy outcomes, by using persuasive arguments, political pressure, positive incentives, and so on. Yes, we do that sometimes. Some scientists do that, but I think it's very risky to do it. And when you do it, you have to be extremely clear that your expertise extends to the science. When it comes to the values, you participate like a citizen. You, of course, have views about values. You vote. You have your right to say these things, but you have to keep it different from the science, because otherwise there is this risk that things get blurred and people reject the facts because they don't like the policy. And this, finally, my final slide. I'm sorry, I think I started a little late also, right? Experts it has to do with the role that experts play in a representative democracy. They do, of course, play a very important role there because they provide knowledge about the state of the world and about the means, how to reach certain goals. But in a democracy, the experts don't set the goals. That is set by the elected representatives, that is by the voters. It's only in an epistocracy, rule of the knowers, that experts set both the goals and provide the factual basis of the knowledge. And I think that there are lots of problems with an epistocracy. I've written about it in my recent book on knowledge and democracy. But certainly, as long as we have a democracy, we should make sure that experts are clear in what roles they play there. And here is a book that just came out this week from our program. Thank you so much.
Now it's on. Thank you, Professor Wikforss, for the lecture. We have microphones on the left and right. If I would like to invite people to come up with questions and comments if you have any. We have 12 minutes before our coffee break. Any questions? Yes, please. Do you hear the question? Is the mic working from the audience?
No.
Well, it's working here, but
I think it's set on mute for the camera too. So maybe if you turn it on there.
Hey.
Yes.
Hey. Sorry for the shades. My glasses broke yesterday, so I have to use this one. It was very interesting. Thank you for the talk about how we have good reasons to distrust experts, especially we belong to echo chambers. So my question will be like, push this further and say, maybe it's rational sometimes to distrust experts, but in which cases do you think it's rational to belong or be in an echo chamber? Because it seems that the only shield for us about distrusting experts in this case, is there a benevolence factor? Someone is not benevolent, we can distrust them, rationally speaking. But when is it rational to belong to an echo chamber? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I'm not sure we have a choice. it's not as if we decide to hop into an echo chamber. I think the idea, Levy's idea, and certainly my view about it too, would be that we just do. We live in a social context that we're kind of thrown into for various reasons. In this social context, it can be in the smaller context, family and friends, we create these trust relations that are just essential to how we function together, but also to how we communicate and spread testimony. And then a slightly larger chamber, we bring in the sources that the news sources and so on that we have. I don't think it's not initially a choice. Then, of course, the more interesting question is, when is irrational sort of, would it be rational? Could you, within this situation, be rational to hop out of it, as it were, of this? You can, and there, of course, you can, I mean, you can certainly imagine, there's this interesting case, what's it called? Tara, she writes about a fundamentalist upbringing in Colorado, I think. Educated, it's called. She grows up in a very, very isolated family situation, very deeply religious, where there's very limited sources of information coming in from the outside, and she's totally convinced of this world. But things start to leak into her echo chamber from outside. And eventually it leaks so much that she gets to college, and then that world explodes for her, and it becomes clear that it's rational for her to opt out of that echo chamber. So you can imagine those situations, but I don't think it's something where you really start to realize that actually the people I trusted, they're not benevolent and they're not competent, and I need to change my context. So that I think we can imagine a situation. But the hard thing, of course, is, and that's one of Levy's points, is that when you are in this echo chamber and things don't leak in, things work well, as it were, for you, it's going to be hard for you to get reasons to leave that group, because this is a group that seems competent and benevolent to you. I do think, like I said, that it almost always leaks, and there will be reasons to dial down your trust in your group when things are not going well. But it's going to be an empirical question.
Professor Bahramian here has a question. Oh, actually, go for it. Sorry.
Thank you.
I apologize.
Does this work?
Yes.
Yeah. I also thank you so much for such a wonderful paper and very relevant to the work that PERITIA does. It's great that we have ended up, both of us, in the same intellectual space after having worked on very different topics. So your paper actually resonates very much, or connects with the paper I'm going to give here in a couple of days' time. So I want to hear your reactions to that trend in feminist epistemology in particular, but also philosophy of science, which denies the fact-value distinction in science. So people like Heather Douglas, Naomi Sherman, Helen Longino, based on arguments from inductive risk and underdetermination, they think that values are values in a thick sense, not just epistemic values, but also ethical values, are part of what goes into science from the very basis of it, or from the very starting point. So the fact-value distinction, going back to Galileo or Hume, etc., should not hold that primary position that maybe you would like to assign to it.
Yes, thank you, Maria. Indeed, it's fun that we work on similar topics. Right now, the sun goes off, so maybe, yeah. But yes, I mean, that's the next thing to discuss, obviously. And I have looked at Longino a bit. And my general take on this at this point is a bit Popperian, I guess, the context of discovery and context of justification. It's obviously clear when you do science that values play a huge role in all sorts of ways, because you're a human being and you're acting. And when you act, you have desires and values so for example, what you choose to study. And that's a big problem, like feminists have been pointing out, that there are certain areas that haven't been studied because it concerns women's health, for example, and people haven't cared about that. So, and values come in other ways too, what you think is important in various ways. And so definitely values play a role in scientific practice, and one shouldn't, and sometimes a bad role in scientific practice, and one should be clear on that. I do think, however, when it comes to the scientific output, well, even if there's been values that's not been, great in the process, if the scientific output is epistemically justified and even better, true, then we have no reason to give up the fact-value distinction here, I think. But I recognize, and I'm looking forward to hearing you talk, I recognize this is, there's a whole can of worms here that I'm not looking at this point so much. Yes, thank you.
Thanks on my behalf as well. So like Maria, I'm going to talk about some overlapping issues in my own talk this afternoon. And I want to kind of clarify whether there is disagreement between us on the rationality issue. So I also want to criticize the views that say, well, you can be perfectly fine inside and in rational terms inside an echo chamber. But you seem to grant that if the echo chamber is working well enough, then it can be rational to hold those beliefs. And I wonder whether it matters to you just how the echo chamber functions, how you so suppose that this is an echo chamber of very clever wishful thinkers who are able to debunk all the contrary evidence and do it perfectly. So there's no leakage in the way that you describe. On my view, that is still irrational in virtue of the wishful thinking aspect involved in this. But is that the case on your view? It seemed like you were granting to Levi that in such a circumstance, you could be perfectly rational if you get rid of all the counter evidence by way of some sort of internally justified method.
Yes, although I think I'm more on your side than I'm thinking that in principle, you could imagine such a case where someone holds very bad beliefs, but given their prior beliefs, all the way down to trusting sources, that for belief formation of these bad beliefs is rational given all of that going on. But you have to have, and that was the point about fundamentalist conditions, you have to have pretty extreme conditions for that to be the case. And I don't think that anyone outside of this sort of sect-like conditions would be in such a situation. There is always at some point, I think, typically ungrounded trust in certain sources, and which feeds disinformation into the system. And once the disinformation is in your belief system, then that will make rational other bad beliefs, right? Because that's the problem, you get these vicious circles. But you're asking an interesting question. Could you imagine? I mean, of course, I would say that motivated reasoning is irrational, wishful thinking is irrational, because it's precisely the skewed cognition where you don't process in accordance with epistemic rationality, given what you believe already. So you're asking me about a different case, I guess, where someone, given what they believe, the whole belief formation is perfectly rational if you just look at how the beliefs interact and so on. But in fact, there is this psychological mechanism, causation is wrong, as it were. And then, of course, I would say, yeah, that's not great, because you also, and this gets you into doxastic justification, right? The question is not just that you have these beliefs, so they're propositionally justified, but also you form the beliefs on the basis of the right causal connection. So I think the case you're talking about is one where the person is not doxastically justified, even if there is propositional justification. And I would agree with you in that case, I think, if that's, but it's going to be very hard to detect, right? We're not experimentally, so that's not going to help us in the wild. But I that's a nice case. I agree with you. It would be a case of doxastically unjustified beliefs, even if it is propositionally justified.
Thank you very much for the questions and indeed for the answers.